The courtroom smelled of old wood and desperation, a place where dreams of justice often withered under the weight of bias. Zeke Turner stood alone at the defendant's table, his worn suit hanging loosely on his frame, his dark eyes burning with a fire that could melt steel. They laughed at him, first the judge, then the prosecutor, a ripple of mockery that spread through the jury like a virus. Zeke wasn't supposed to be here. A black mechanic from a small Alabama town, he'd been framed for a robbery he didn't commit, caught in a web of lies spun by a corrupt sheriff and a town eager to pin blame. The evidence? A grainy security tape and a witness who couldn't look him in the eye. But Zeke had something they didn't expect, a mind sharper than the gavel that mocked him. "Mr. Turner," Judge Harlan Crow sneered, his jowls quaking with amusement, "you really think you can defend yourself? This ain't a garage, you're no lawyer." The courtroom chuckled, a sound that cut deeper than any blade. Zeke's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of every stare, every whispered slur, every assumption that he was less than human. He took a breath, steadying himself. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but clear, "I may not have a degree, but I know the law. And I know the truth." The room fell silent, the judge's smirk faltering. Zeke wasn't just fighting for his freedom, was fighting for his dignity, for every black man who'd been laughed out of a courtroom, for every soul told they didn't belong. The prosecutor, Abigail Voss, stood, her heels clicking like gunfire on the hardwood floor. "This is a waste of time," she snapped, tossing her blonde hair. "The defendant is clearly guilty. Let's move to sentencing." Her confidence was a wall, built on years of privilege and unchallenged power. But Zeke saw the cracks: her reliance on shaky evidence, her dismissal of procedure. He'd spent nights in his cell poring over law books, memorizing statutes, piecing together a defense no one thought he could muster. "Your Honor," Zeke said, stepping forward, "the prosecution's case violates Brady v. Maryland. They withheld exculpatory evidence, a second camera angle showing I was across town during the robbery." Gasps rippled through the jury. Voss's face reddened, her papers slipping from her grip. Judge Crow leaned back, his amusement replaced by unease. "You're out of line, Mr. Turner," he growled, but his voice lacked conviction. Zeke didn't stop. "Furthermore, the witness, Mr. Callahan, perjured himself. His testimony contradicts his own phone records, which I subpoenaed." He slid a document across the table, his handwriting neat despite the cheap paper. The defense attorney, a young public defender named Tim Wells, stared wide-eyed, realizing he'd underestimated his client. The jury shifted, some leaning forward, others whispering. The air crackled with doubt. Voss recovered, slamming her hand on the table. "This is absurd. He's a mechanic, not a scholar. He's manipulating the court." Her voice was shrill, betraying her fear. Zeke met her gaze, unflinching. "The law doesn't care about my job, ma'am. It cares about facts. And the facts say I'm innocent." The judge banged his gavel, but it was a hollow sound, drowned by the growing murmurs. "Order!" Crow shouted, his face a mask of frustration. He'd expected an easy case, a quick conviction to clear his docket. Instead, he was facing a man who refused to bend, whose intellect shone brighter than the polished wood of the bench. Zeke's mind raced. He'd grown up in a town where justice was a word reserved for white folks, where his father had been beaten for looking at a cop the wrong way. He'd learned early that survival meant outsmarting the system, not begging for its mercy. In his cell, he'd turned sleepless nights into study sessions, using a smuggled copy of Black's Law Dictionary and a library cart that creaked under the weight of his ambition. He wasn't just fighting for himself, was fighting for his daughter, Lila, who waited at home, her faith in him the only thing keeping her from breaking. "Mr. Turner," Crow said, his tone colder now, "you're treading on thin ice. You think you can outsmart this court?" Zeke's jaw tightened. He knew the risk: pushed too hard, and he'd be silenced, pushed too little, and he'd be buried. "I'm not here to outsmart anyone," he said. "I'm here to prove I'm innocent." And I will. The trial stretched into days, each one a battle. Voss threw every trick at him, leading questions, sudden objections, witnesses who stumbled over their stories. But Zeke was relentless. He cross-examined with precision, catching lies in real time, citing cases like Gideon versus Wainwright and Miranda versus Arizona as if he'd been born in a law library. The jury, once skeptical, began to nod. Tim Wells, the public defender, started taking notes, his role shifting from advocate to student. On the third day, the tension peaked. Voss called a surprise witness, Sheriff Daniels, the man who'd arrested Zeke. Daniels swaggered to the stand, his badge gleaming, his smirk a mirror of the judge's. "I saw Turner at the crime scene," he lied, his voice dripping with confidence. "He was holding the bag of cash." Zeke stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Sheriff, can you confirm the time of the robbery?" Daniels hesitated, sensing a trap. "Around 8 p.m., he said. Zeke nodded, pulling out a receipt. "This is from a gas station 10 miles away, time-stamped 8:03 p.m. My signature's on it. Care to explain how I was in two places at once?" The courtroom erupted. Jurors whispered, Voss shouted objections, and Crow's gavel slammed repeatedly. Daniel's face drained of color, his lies unraveling under Zeke's calm, relentless pressure. The judge's laughter was gone, replaced by a scowl that betrayed his discomfort. He wasn't just losing control of the trial, was losing control of the narrative. Zeke's daughter, Lila, sat in the back row, her 12-year-old hands clasped tightly. She'd snuck in against her mother's wishes, her eyes wide with pride and fear. Zeke caught her gaze, drawing strength from her presence. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was showing her what it meant to stand tall, to demand respect in a world that offered none. By the fifth day, the tide had turned. The jury, once hostile, now hung on Zeke's every word. Voss's case crumbled as Zeke exposed inconsistencies, from faulty evidence chains to coerced statements. Tim Wells, now a reluctant ally, began feeding Zeke case law, marveling at his client's instincts. Even the bailiff, a grizzled man who'd seen hundreds of trials, whispered to a colleague, "This guy's something else." The climax came during closing arguments. Voss painted Zeke as a criminal mastermind, a desperate man faking intelligence to dodge justice. Her words were venom, each one a reminder of the stereotypes Zeke had fought his whole life. When it was his turn, Zeke stood, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm no lawyer. I'm a father, a mechanic, a man who's made mistakes but never stole a dime. This case isn't just about might, it's about whether truth matters more than prejudice. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the lies. Now, you decide what justice looks like." The jury deliberated for hours, the courtroom heavy with anticipation. Lila sat with her mother now, both holding their breath. Judge Crow avoided Zeke's eyes, his earlier arrogance replaced by unease. Voss paced, her confidence shattered. Tim Wells sat beside Zeke, whispering, "You've done something incredible here." When the jury returned, the forewoman stood, her voice trembling. "We find the defendant not guilty." The room exploded, gasps, cheers, and Voss's furious objections. Lila ran to Zeke, tears streaming, as he wrapped her in his arms. Judge Crow banged his gavel, but no one listened. For the first time in days, Zeke smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. But the story wasn't over. As Zeke walked free, he knew the town wouldn't change overnight. The sheriff's lies, the judge's laughter, the prosecutor's venom, they were symptoms of a deeper sickness. Yet, in that courtroom, he'd planted a seed. He'd shown Lila, the jury, and even himself that genius isn't bound by skin or status. It's born from courage, honed by struggle, and proven in the fire of truth. Zeke stepped into the sunlight, Lila's hand in his. The crowd outside buzzed, some cheering, others glaring. He didn't care. He'd faced their laughter and won. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, he knew this was only the beginning. Zeke Turner stepped out of the courthouse, the Alabama sun blazing down, turning the steps into a stage where every eye was on him. Lila clung to his hand, her small fingers trembling with a mix of relief and awe. The crowd outside was a fractured mirror of the townsmen clapped, their faces lit with admiration, while others whispered slurs, their eyes dark with resentment. Zeke felt the weight of both, but he walked tall, his worn suit now a badge of victory. He'd beaten the system, not with fists but with words, not with anger but with truth. Yet, he knew this wasn't the end of the fight, it was just the first battle. Back inside, Judge Harlan Crow sat in his chambers, the echo of the gavel still ringing in his ears. He'd misjudged Zeke, dismissed him as another statistic, a black man destined for a cell. Now, his laughter felt like a stain he couldn't scrub off. He stared at the case file, Zeke's neat handwriting scrawled across motions and subpoenas, each one a jab at his pride. Crow wasn't a bad man, not in his own mind, just a product of a town where assumptions ran deeper than the river. But Zeke's performance had cracked something in him, a flicker of doubt about the system he'd upheld for decades. Across town, Sheriff Daniels was less reflective. He stormed into his office, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. His deputies avoided his gaze, sensing the storm brewing. Daniels had built his career on control, on bending the truth to fit the town's unwritten rules. Zeke's victory wasn't just a low sit, was a public humiliation. He'd underestimated the mechanic, assuming a man with oil-stained hands couldn't wield the law like a weapon. Now, whispers of his perjury were spreading, and the town's trust in him was fraying like an old rope. Zeke, meanwhile, returned home to a small clapboard house on the edge of town. His wife, Marla, waited on the porch, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She pulled him into a fierce hug, her voice breaking. "You did it, Zeke. You showed them." Lila beamed, clutching a notebook where she'd scribbled notes from the trial, her young mind already dreaming of law school. The family sat together that night, eating a simple meal of cornbread and greens, but it tasted like freedom. Still, Zeke's mind churned. He knew the town's anger wouldn't fade easily, and the sheriff's pride was a dangerous thing. The next morning, the local paper ran a front-page story, "Mechanic Outsmarts Court in Stunning Upset." The article was fair, detailing Zeke's self-defense and the prosecution's collapse, but the comments online were a battlefield. Some praised Zeke's brilliance, calling him a hero, others spewed venom, accusing him of cheating the system. The divide was stark: race, class, and power splitting the town like a fault line. Zeke read the story in silence, his coffee growing cold. He didn't want fame, he wanted change. At the diner where Marla worked, conversations buzzed. Regulars who'd once nodded politely at Zeke now debated his case. "He's no lawyer," one man grumbled, his fork stabbing at pancakes. "Just got lucky." Across the room, a young woman countered, "Lucky? He outsmarted a judge. That's not luck, that's genius." The diner became a microcosm of the town, each table a debate over justice, prejudice, and what it meant to be heard. Zeke didn't rest on his victory. He started visiting the library daily, helping others with legal questions, folks facing evictions, traffic fines, or worse. His cellmate, Jamal, had been convicted on a shaky drug charge, and Zeke was already drafting a motion for him. Word spread, and soon people were knocking on his door, their stories echoing his own, dismissed, stereotyped, trapped by a system that didn't see them. Zeke listened, his quiet strength drawing them in. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore, he was a beacon. But trouble brewed. Sheriff Daniels, stung by the trial, began digging into Zeke's life, looking for dirt. He leaned on old contacts, spread rumors that Zeke was stirring unrest. One night, a brick crashed through Zeke's window, a note tied to it, "Know your place." Lila screamed, and Marla's hands shook as she swept up the glass. Zeke's jaw clenched, but he refused to cower. He reported the incident, knowing Daniels would bury it, and installed a cheap security camera. The town was testing him, and he wouldn't back down. The tension came to a head at a town hall meeting, called to address community concerns. Zeke attended, despite Marla's pleas. The room was packed, the air thick with anger and hope. Daniels stood at the podium, his voice booming about law and order, a veiled jab at Zeke. When it was time for questions, Zeke rose, his presence silencing the room. "Sheriff," he said, "you swore an oath to protect us all. So why do some of us get justice, and others get your lies?" The crowd gasped. Daniel's face twisted, but before he could respond, an older white woman, Mrs. Carter, stood. She'd been in the jury, one of the few who'd believed Zeke from the start. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I saw what happened in that courtroom. Zeke Turner didn't just win, showed us what's broken. We need to listen." Others joined in, black and white, young and old, their voices rising. Some defended Daniels, clinging to the status quo, others demanded accountability. The meeting spiraled into chaos, arguments erupting like sparks. Zeke stood quietly, watching the town confront its own soul. He didn't need to say more, his truth had ignited something bigger. Days later, a local lawyer, impressed by Zeke's trial, offered to mentor him. Sarah Nguyen, a fierce advocate for civil rights, saw in Zeke a rare talent. "You've got the mind for this," she told him, handing him a stack of law books. "Let's make it official." Zeke hesitated, was 40, with a family to support, but Lila's proud smile pushed him forward. He enrolled in night classes, balancing work, family, and study. Each case he read, from Brown versus Board to Loving versus Virginia, felt like a piece of his own story. The town didn't heal overnight. Daniels retired under pressure, his lies exposed by a state investigation Zeke's case had triggered. Judge Crow, chastened, began questioning his own biases, though he'd never admit it. Voss moved to a bigger city, her reputation tarnished. And Zeke? He kept fighting, not just for himself but for everyone who'd been silenced. His home became a hub for community meetings, where people shared stories and planned change. Lila often led discussions, her confidence growing with every word. Years later, Zeke stood in a different courtroom, this time as a licensed attorney. His first case was for Jamal, whose conviction was overturned. As the judge read the ruling, Zeke glanced at Lila in the gallery, now a college freshman studying pre-law. Marla sat beside her, tears of pride in her eyes. The victory wasn't just legal, it was personal, a promise kept to his family and his community. Zeke's story spread beyond the town, inspiring articles, podcasts, even a documentary. But he remained humble, still fixing cars on weekends, still greeting neighbors with a quiet nod. He knew justice wasn't a single win, it was a lifelong fight. Every case he took, every person he helped, was a step toward a world where no one was laughed out of a courtroom. The town still argued about Zeke. Some called him a troublemaker, others, a hero. But they all agreed on one thing: he'd changed them. His courage had forced them to look in the mirror, to question what was right, what was fair, and what it meant to be human. So, what do you think? Where does justice begin, and how do we heal a divided community?